Anchored Glide does exactly what it says. It just removes Zephyr's gravity passive and makes it that of a normal Warframe. It doesn't touch the critical chance passive at all, and it does also give you 15% strength, but that's not really a big deal. And it can go in the Exilus slot. In truth, I don't think you should use this. I don't think anyone should use this. Slotting this feels like a really bad hit to opportunity cost because we have so many other great Exilus mods. So don't use this. Use something else. Unless you want to, but I don't think it's a good idea. I'll be honest, I had no idea the bullet jump reset was a thing until I was like copy pasting the description of the mod into the original script. I tried using natural talent to make the animation for Tailwind, or the boost duration of Tailwind, faster, but it didn't work. So it's a little wonky to control, and I don't think this is a really big deal. I think you should just kind of... You can play with it if you want, but I don't really care about it. If I want to get around, I'll just use bullet jump and angle glide and stuff. That doesn't really cost energy. Anyway, moving on to the interesting shit. Tailwind's damage is increased by 100% for each enemy you hit. What does that mean? That's what that means. The damage bonus this mod can accumulate has no cap. Meaning, as long as you can stay off the ground for 2 seconds, you can essentially get infinite damage. If you do want to play with this, I suggest maybe putting on a little bit of power strength, but really, with the damage increase, you probably don't even need it. In fact, with the kind of damage increases that are possible, I bet you could get away with not worrying about strength at all. Each enemy you hit with Tailwind's radius, or directly, or dive bomb, or its radius, will just add another 100% to the damage increase. And then the damage increase will be applied to the overall damage of Dive Bomb, or Tailwind, probably Dive Bomb, realistically. And it even has an interesting play with another augment that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Again, so the only real limit to this limitless power is that you cannot be on the ground for more than 2 seconds. If you fail to do that, the damage bonus you gain will be lost instantly, which is a bummer. But it can be rebuilt. It just takes a little bit of time and patience. But the overall strategy, if you're going to use this, is not to touch the ground for that long at all. So do what you can to not do that. It sounds like kind of a buzzkill to the overall feel of the mod, but really, with the amount of damage this thing can do, this might as well be the only form of balance holding this infinite power back. Of course, aside from the clunky aspect of stacking it to infinity and keeping it that way. Looking at the mod, we can see that we have 2 stats to worry about. That which is power increase, 100%, and the limitation of the time on the ground. Both of these numbers are static. You cannot change them with mods. That sounds like a bummer, but you don't really need more damage. I do kind of wish we could push the duration a little higher, but that might be asking too much if you can do, stuff like this. This shit is practically Zephyr's Touch of Death. And the best part is she can build it faster and deliver it better than Gara. Sorry, Gara lovers, but it is just better than doing this over and over again. So, I'm not sorry. Okay, so you want to give this a shot, right? First off, congratulations, you know how to have fun in a video game. Because this certainly isn't a meta thing, I promise you. You're going to be hitting a lot of enemies, and this is a meme build anyway. So, anyway, the first step is you need to maintain hover glide. Or if you subsumed over her 1 for something else, you're going to be hopping and hovering a lot. Next step is you get nice and high up and you use, I don't know, like Airburst or Tornado, or the next augment we're talking about. And then dive bomb into the cluster of enemies, bullet jump away, or, if you have room, tailwind dash up and out of there. Activate the hover or aim glide again, and repeat the process. Keep turbulence active to, stay protected, and you have yourself a way to kill pretty much anything with enough time. It really can feel a little clunky, but there is no denying how fun it is to see the damage increase climb up higher and higher. So go ahead and have fun with that. Moving on. Airburst Rounds. Each enemy hit by Airburst increases secondary damage by 40% for 14 seconds. This is already different from target fixation because both of these stats are changeable. Damage per enemy hit scales with strength, and the effect duration scales with ability duration. However, this does have a damage cap of 500%, and that is unaffected by mods. Alright, so the hit condition for the augment applies to both the airburst projectile itself and the explosion radius. What this means for us is that enemies hit with both the projectile and the explosion radius just count as being hit twice. This little detail makes this augment way more usable than you might initially think when reading what's on the tin. And even more so with a Zephyr built for high range. Using Airburst again will refresh the duration, and refreshing will keep the highest bonus between the old and the new Airbursts, so you don't need to worry about losing damage if you throw it at a smaller group of enemies, even though it used to not work that way. From what I found, you don't need a lot of strength weighting to effectively hit the damage cap, even in low density star chart missions. This is ultimately due to the fact that you have a way to get 2 times the bonus for every enemy present. Again, by casting Airburst once to get them all together, then casting it on the larger group using the Airburst punch-through to hit every single enemy with both the projectile and the explosion. If you are building strength for Airburst, keep an eye on the ability tab and track the damage increase per enemy, and honestly even multiply it by 2. And that should help you have a better idea of how much strength you'll actually need, depending on the mission you're going into. I found the middle ground between 30 and 50 is just right for lower level star chart missions. But keep in mind, I haven't found it super difficult to get the 500% damage cap with 40% strength, simply due to the massive enemy density of higher level missions. This just translates to needing less strength on missions with higher density, so the further you go, the less strength you'll need. I should have mentioned this earlier, but using Airburst on a mid-strength Zephyr in low to mid-level missions will likely just kill the enemies you hit, save for a couple heavy units. And this is just due to its heavy slash weighting and status chance. So keep that in mind when you're doing this on mid to low level missions. Moving on to using the augment, it's really fun. Especially when you get access to the high level weapons, stuff like the Piranha Prime or secondaries with big idiot damage and fire rate. If you have the mind to remember or an extra mod slot on a weapon, you might find that it's worth making a whole nother build with this use case specifically in mind. If you do that, you can remove Hornet Strike in favor of something else the weapon is missing. This is assuming you don't have Arcanes unlocked yet, and if you don't, the damage this gives you is comparable and even exceeds the damage an Arcane can give you. Running Hornet Strike with that kind of damage increase is going to give you less damage than you'd think due to diminishing returns. If you don't believe me, I did the math. I'm pretty sure I did the math right. But when you're running a maxed out Airburst Rounds and adding Hornet Strike on top of that, you're only getting a 36% damage increase. If you're to choose one or the other, Airburst Rounds will give you a 156% increase, or a 1.56 times total damage. This is compared to Hornet Strike. Again, this is all just how diminishing returns works, which is why it's beneficial to drop Hornet Strike and add, say, another multiplier like an elemental or maybe crit damage or something else the weapon needs to make it more usable or functional. It's better to spec into multiple stats than dump everything into one. Or at least that's what I'm ultimately trying to tell you. Of course, it depends on weapons and stuff, and it's kind of nuanced, but yeah, whatever, you get it. Let's move on. Jetstream is our third augment for Turbulence, and it provides 40% sprint speed, as well as 100% projectile speed to Zephyr and her allies within range of Turbulence while it's active. Buff to movement speed and projectile speed scale off of strength. The buff radius is exactly tied to the radius of Turbulence, so it scales off of range, and allies will retain the buff for an additional 3 seconds after leaving Turbulence's range. Of course, the duration of the buff lasts for exactly as long as Turbulence does, since Turbulence gives you the buff, so scales from duration. If you're running this, you're probably expecting to keep Turbulence up at all times, and doing so is an effective permanent buff on all these stats. The movement speed buff does stack on top of other movement buffs, like Volt Speed or Wisp's Haste, and the buff does not only apply to other players, it also applies to allies in general. Examples for things on the list of allies include, but are probably not limited to, Kavor Defectors, the escort drones in the plains of Eidolon, all Spectres, companions, and rescue targets. But remember, this only works when they're in range of Turbulence, and they only get 3 seconds of the buff when they exit Turbulence's radius. To further state the obvious, the more you put into strength, the more you and your friends are going to notice the difference this augment can provide. And if you do plan to build for strength, be sure to give Hoverglide another go once it's active, as it does greatly help its movement speed and make it feel just way better to use. So the movement speed buff is simple enough to understand, right? But what's going on with projectile speed? I'm going to take a minute or two to talk about it in depth, so if you already know what it does, here's the time skip for the demonstrations. This is your escape. This is really targeted to newer players, or just people who don't know what it's doing and want to better understand. So if you already know or don't care, go ahead and skip. Alright, so projectile speed can affect two stats. The speed of the physical projectile fired from a weapon and the damage fall-off ranges. These two stats aren't available on every weapon, however, because weapons like bows fire a physical instance of damage, the arrow, with travel time, and this can be sped up with projectile speed. But since the bow has no fall-off stat, there's no changes that get applied in that area. This next case is where you have a weapon that fires with hit scan properties, but also retains a fall-off stat. This fall-off stat has two numbers that represent a range or distance measured in meters, from which your weapon will suffer a linear decrease in damage from 100% to the weapon's minimum damage. The max damage reduction rates between weapons varies a lot, and can be between levels like 50% on the Strun Prime, and 99.47% on the Felarks. And these two are only the most extreme cases, so any other weapon you'll find with a fall-off stat, primarily shotguns if I didn't mention it earlier, are going to vary largely between these two numbers. Unfortunately, the only place you can find the numbers for the fall-off damage reduction is on the wiki. I don't know why they don't put it in the game. It should be in the game. But if you want to know the maximum damage reduction on your weapon, you have to go there. All other hit scan weapons that don't have a listed fall-off stat take no change from projectile speed whatsoever. Like, nothing changes. Oddly enough, though, projectile speed can still show up in Riven rolls, so if you're looking for a harmless negative, projectile speed's a pretty safe one to take. Just another little side note, because Warframe can't be simple. Some hit scan weapons do have like a firing animation or an effect that makes it look like it's firing a projectile. These are often like a glowing bullet trail, or a good example is the Ambassador's like beam repeater trail. Anyway, don't be confused because these are still hit scan weapons. Now there is kind of a separate rule for hit scan weapons, and really they all have a fall off of 300 meters. This is regardless of any fall off stats that are or are not on the weapon, by the way. But I think of it less as fall off and more of just like a maximum travel limit, because anything that travels further than that just won't register a hit. If you do decide to check the wiki for fall off stats, you'll notice a lot of weapons that have a fall off start at 0 meters, a fall off end at infinite, and a damage reduction of 100%. These are all the hit scan weapons, and it kind of confused me when I was first looking at it, so now you won't be confused. The only exception to these rules come from sniper rifles, all of which have a fall off start of 400 meters, a fall off end of 600, and a damage reduction of 50%. These rules were made because open world reasons, so really you shouldn't ever worry about it. And that finishes the projectile speed explanation. So now we're going to get some visual examples of the speed increase provided by the projectile speed bonus, and look at how they interact with your weapons. I have a good variety of them picked out, and when I was testing and getting footage for these, I found that there were a lot of weapons that benefited from projectile speed that I didn't originally consider until I thought to try them. I'm sure I didn't find everything that does and doesn't work with this, so don't think of this as the comprehensive list of weapons that have an interesting effect with projectile speed. So the obvious things are like projectiles from bows firing their arrows and explosive rounds from launchers like the Tonkor, but there's one item that I think could actually get an objective damage increase from the projectile speed, and those are the glaives from the Cedo's alt fire. Projectile speed seems to make them bounce between the enemies more, making them apply more status. I didn't test this extensively, but I do feel like I noticed a little bit of an increase, so worth looking into. The other things that work are pulse weapons like the Fulman's primary fire, the Arca and Tenet Plasmor, but they get 3 bonuses in the sense that they get a boost to fall off, further projectile distance, and faster projectile speed. This is an objective DPS increase because you're hitting more people down the hallway because it's traveling faster and not losing damage until it gets way further on in its travel. More obvious selections on guns that actually shoot a projectile, like the Fenmore, the Latum, or the Felarks. The Felarks in particular, because as I mentioned earlier, its fall-off damage reduction is particularly egregious. So it gets a damage increase as well, as you're able to hit, again, more people down the hallway. But think of it as a damage increase not in the sense of you're gaining damage, but rather you aren't losing damage. What was more surprising to me about Jetstream's effects is that it works on melee weapons with the projectile or throwing mechanic. So yes, that does mean the glaives, Glaive Prime, Zorus, Sorata, they all get thrown faster and farther. And it even worked on the Colossus Warfans because its heavy attack launches multiple dagger projectiles. By the way, the Colossus is just a good weapon, and if you want to see someone making excellent use of the Colossus with Zephyr, I suggest you watch this video by Ayun Tey. This dude is really cool and really knows his shit, and all his videos are super easy to watch, super short, well explained. So if you want to learn more about interesting and effective ways to play, go check him out. You'll find his channel in the description. Anyway, aside from that, we can talk about how yes, indeed, it does work on gunblades. All the gunblades do in fact have a fall-off stat, so the effect is applied to that just as well as you'd think. But the interesting one is the Stropha, which fires less pellets or bullets and more of a pulse projectile. And because of that, it not only gets a fall-off increase, but travels further and hits more enemies. The last one I thought to test was the Tenet Envoy, as it gets the slowed laser-guided missile version when you aim down sights. The primary fire does get the bonus, but when you aim down sights and give it the laser guidance, it might as well be the same exact thing, and it has no bonus whatsoever. So the laser guidance gets no speed bonus. Now, there are a few things that don't work, because maybe they're just not classified in the game correctly, or because of bugs. But the Inodem's Incarnon form launches waves when you use it in the air, and they get no benefit whatsoever from Jetstream at all. A really big bummer to everyone who likes using Exodia Contagion, because it too gets no benefit from Jetstream. And this one's interesting because it's listed on the Jetstream wiki page. It doesn't work on the Exceltra for some reason. The only reason I could think of is that it's self-propelled, I guess. They're mini rockets. I don't know. It's still a bug. They should fix it. So, what does Jetstream really boil down to? Well, for one, it's a permanent speed boost if you're keeping turbulence up, right? But it's also a permanent weapon usability increase. Not for fire rate or magazine size or reload speed or anything like that, but a lot of weapons do get a true and major benefit when you use it, in the sense that they can reach farther and do more damage further, potentially hit more enemies if it's the right kind of weapon, right? But one thing's for sure is that higher projectile speed really does feel great on a lot of weapons. And while it may be like a foolish idea, I feel like projectile speed still has some things we haven't figured out about it. It may not be the case, right? But I feel like there's a few weapons that could benefit particularly well from increasing the stat. I mean, the biggest case of this is the demonstration with the Cedo and making the glaives hit more. And Zephyr can make excellent use of the Cedo and its alt fire when she uses tornadoes, and especially this next augment. So I think there's things to play with. Now, a question remains: if the augment is so excellent, why don't I use it? It's pretty simple. It isn't because it's bad, perish the thought. I just haven't made a lot of room for it in my Zephyr builds. As you've likely learned if you watched the guide video, thanks for all the views by the way, it's my preference to dump strength for range, duration, and efficiency, as well as leave room for maybe a few little add-ons. But rest assured, after I've released this video, and to get over this nasty burnout, I have likely already started altering my builds. So what I need to do is just find a good all-rounder build that does bias strength and use this on it. One of the commenters from the last video, you know exactly who you are, told me that they run Jetstream like almost all the time. So I'm clearly doing something wrong, right? Either way, that's Jetstream. Let's move on to the next one. We've made it to Funnel Cloud. Creates 8 additional tornadoes, all of which are 50% their original size and speed, and won't pick up enemies. It's unaffected by mods entirely. It only benefits from strength, range, and duration the same way base tornado does. Okay, first off, why the fuck would I want that? If I can't make enemies float up into the air and do crowd control, it's the worst. When I read the mod, I put emphasis on the word "they won't," because that doesn't mean they don't. You just need to ragdoll them. Like, that's it. I don't know why the mod card doesn't mention that aspect. It really is a turnoff. The mod also mentions that they're half the size. Pretty sure that applies to the pickup range as well as the damage field. So I'm thinking it's down to 5 meters instead of 10 compared to regular tornadoes. But if I'm honest, I don't think it's worth testing, since the main ways you're gonna make that happen are with Airburst and even slam attacks from melee weapons. Both of those will likely rival or be larger than 5 meters wide if the original pickup range is 10 meters. Okay, so what else is interesting about funnel clouds? Under the right circumstances, it can act like a huge damage multiplier. The circumstances I'm talking about are related to weapons that have certain fire modes or fire types, the primary examples of which are weapons with infinite body punch through and AoE attributes. So what does that translate to in practice? Allow me to show you. So how did that happen? Let me explain it on paper. Alright, so let's say we have a funnel cloud. This is our funnel cloud right here. This is the tornado itself. Now, what we know about tornadoes and funnel clouds, they work identically, right? Essentially, you do damage to the tornado, the entity itself, and it spreads that damage or applies that damage through its critical damage application to its radius. Now, this sometimes strips things like gun CO and other quirky behaviors, since now technically the tornado's damage, but we're going to ignore that for now. So this is how this works. And Funnel Cloud gives us 8 more. We have 3 already, so that gives us 11. So we have control that. Copy, 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 copy. Essentially, we have a ton of these, and they're going to be spread out all over the place. Pretty conglomerated. They're actually going to be much closer than this. And you can see how the gradient gets darker and darker. What's happening? Well, the damage that they do gets stacked on top of each other. They don't do damage to each other, but everyone inside takes the damage that, all the rest take. This is an 11, so you can imagine how this kind of quickly becomes a problem. Everyone inside here is going to get the same damage dealt. If you shoot a Corinth shot, right, with the explosive shot, it's going to come in here, and it's going to do its damage to pretty much every single one of them. Now, they're going to be spread out however their AI wants them to be, but essentially each one gets hit, and each one gets the damage applied to its circle. So everyone inside feels that damage, and you can see how this just pretty much decimates the area. And we know this works for weapons with AoE because, again, it applies damage in an area, but it also works with weapons with infinite punch through, because you can shoot into one and it's just going to keep on going, and it's going to hit, everyone through here, and all the enemies as well. So that counts as an instance of damage as well. And a lot of the time these weapons have a pretty big projectile width. So sometimes these ones get grazed, this one gets grazed, this one gets, so it just works. It works really well. It's a really gross way to do damage. And with as great as this is, it's always going to be kind of hard to get every single tornado unless you have a really big AoE weapon. And even then, the fall-off is usually pretty bad at the edges of weapons like that. So you're never going to be getting the full damage as if we really need it. So I kind of stumbled upon a solution. I was using Entangle to see how that played with Zephyr's abilities. And there's some interesting behavior I kind of remembered about tornadoes. Like I mentioned in the last video, the AI for the tornadoes, at least the wandering tornadoes, will seek out the groups with greatest density. Well, the whole purpose of Entangle is to create a dense population of enemies in one spot. Casting the wandering funnel clouds on a group like this results in this. I just want to see what happens. If I get them all on top of each other, let's hop over and just wander cast. Okay, well that's Toxin. Yep. And then when they're all dead, they go away. They all get into one spot on top of all the enemies, literally primed for a massive damage payload. This Entangle setup will absolutely amplify AoE damage, but I've found more success with this setup and weapons with infinite punch through, like the Fulmin. Here's what it can do with a middle-of-the-game Fulmin build. Serration isn't even maxed. It's a bare-bones build, no galvanized mods, no arcanes, and watch what it does to the enemies in this setup. Yeah. And here's what it can do with a more high-end Fulmin build. By the way, that's without any stacks from galvanized mods or arcanes. I'm pretty sure a lot of the damage in this setup is coming from electricity, since the Tesla coil status effect hugely benefits from enemy density, and also tornadoes just do really well with electricity. This whole setup just gives electricity everything it needs to perform. I think it's also coming from the fact that weapons like the Fulmin fire with like a pulse fire, or they launch a persistent projectile that's always doing damage almost like every frame. For the amount of time that it's in the tornado, it's continuously doing damage multiple times. So I think that's another way it's multiplying its own damage, or at least I'm pretty sure, but I think it's safe to say it's doing damage multiple times to the tornado it's in as it travels through it. Couldn't that be the critical multiplier? No, it's not. I'll show you why. I can prove it. I believe. Hell, we can prove it with extra electricity damage. Because that's what Volt Shield do. They multiply the damage by 2, critical damage by 2, modded. And apply additional electric damage. New damage. So, I mean, it's like adding another mod on there. Which is good, because that's a multiplier. Whoop! Look at their health. That don't look... Oh gosh, that's a lot of tick damage. That don't look like multiplier to me. Or that don't look like, you know, the same kind of effect we got. It is an improvement. Large one. But it was not a complete full strip. What does this mean? The multiple effect, or like the multiple tornadoes on funnel clouds have an effect. And they take the damage and share it and just apply it to more people. There you go. You can do this with regular Airburst. You just need to wait till all the enemies stop being ragdolled and get up so they're not floating in the air, because them being on the ground and taking the hit from the original weapon as well as all the tornadoes is part of what makes this so freaking powerful. Okay, so how practical is this in an actual mission? This is the simulacrum. We have full control of where the enemies are. It's true that in a normal mission, you're not going to get the same perfect setup here, but in just like a regular survival with high density, at least some of the tornadoes are going to bias the group. It won't be all 11 of them, because there's enemies elsewhere that other tornadoes want to be, but it will be enough to stack your damage a couple times over, and it will perform similarly. So it may not be the most practical, but it does work, and setting up a payload of damage like that after fighting a group of enemies and dealing with that stress would undoubtedly be incredibly rewarding. Now to move on to a melee-oriented showcase. But before we get too deep into that, I want to cover a little detail about both funnel clouds and regular tornadoes. I may be jumping the gun a little bit because I was going to go over all the details I missed about tornado in the chapter after this, but this does apply to this funnel cloud showcase, so I'm going to include this detail here. So if you weren't aware already, melee slam attacks do bring in a good bit of combo, because everyone affected by the slam radius counts as a melee hit and subsequently qualifies for a combo count gain, especially on weapons with bigger slam radius such as hammers and such. I've discovered that you can use slam attacks on tornadoes and funnel clouds to gain combo faster than you normally would. The only way this can make sense to me is that the tornadoes themselves count as entities to gain combo off of, but I don't know about that because you can't gain combo by hitting them normally. Or some of the melee slam radius gets brought into the tornado or is applied to the enemies inside, and it's like a quick stacking for melee combo. Because the more enemies the tornado has, the better. I'm not sure which one it is, but using slam attacks on tornadoes that have enemies in them, or on funnel clouds that have enemies surrounding them, will greatly increase the amount of combo you gain on slam attacks. As an example, I'll just cast normal tornado on a group of 20 enemies with a dagger, and I'll just slam attack the tornado a couple times, and I have enough combo to heavy attack the tornadoes and deal damage to everyone inside. Funnel Cloud seems to work the same way, especially if they're not up in the air. I found that you want to hit the tornado, or try to hit the tornado, and not just the ground around it, and that seems to work. That's great. It's actually really cool. But why am I bringing it up? Does anyone remember the Archititron? Yeah, the hammer that increases its slam damage for every kill it gets. The one that provides 100% damage and stacks multiplicatively 10 times. And does electricity damage. Yeah, that one. It can do this. We got it. Yeah. Turns out, if you slam attack the funnel clouds or tornadoes and give them electricity, and they kill anyone with that electricity damage, that kill gets transferred to the slam capacitor of the Archititron. Holy shit, look at that, it works. Even though the tornado killed it with its own electricity damage, if the Archititron gave it that damage, it counts. At least it works this way in the sim. I'm pretty sure it works this way outside as well, but please, give it a shot. One-shotting an Acolyte is no joke. I'm not the only one to use a slam attack build with Zephyr. As a matter of fact, Dystopia, who I mentioned in the last video, he covered the crit inherit stats for the tornadoes in the last video. Well, he has a slam attack build that is pretty similar. It uses the Fragor Prime and Zada's Whisper. The title is here. Of course, the link is in the description, so go check it out if you're curious. But it seems to work in a pretty similar way. And there's one more thing that plays pretty well with funnel clouds and its ability to spread large amounts of damage over a wide area. You know, we covered a way to do that with just Zephyr herself earlier. Yeah, that one. Yeah, it works. Target fixation and funnel clouds do in fact synergize. Similar to melee slams giving you more combo, tornadoes and funnel clouds both multiply hit detection for target fixation. You can have one enemy in the tornadoes or funnel cloud. You can hit the tornadoes with dive bomb and you'll get up to a 700% damage increase per hit instead of 100%. I haven't seen anyone else talk about this, so until someone corrects me and says that they talked about it in their video, I'm the first. Too bad it's not that practical. Like, don't get me wrong, this setup is hilarious for meme builds, because this starts getting so effective at doing damage, you have to cast funnel clouds over and over again. Because you just kill them. You just max out their damage outright. You hit the ground, deal the damage, and they disappear. They're still there because the timer's still going down, but when you max the damage on funnel clouds, they just go away and stop doing damage. They will still crowd control if you use Airburst, but they just won't do weapon damage anymore. The way Tornado works is that they're still there visually, but you just can't, pass your weapon damage through them. Funnel clouds just disappear. They just go away. And it is per tornado. I told you, or I mentioned last video, that they all go away at the same time. They don't. It's per tornado. But if you're doing this dive bomb build, they're all gonna go away. It's all the same. So maybe not the most usable discovery, but someone will try it. It isn't practical, but it does work and it can kill. So I'm looking forward to seeing someone try it because I'm not gonna do it. And I think that covers all of the augments. Now, moving on to correcting the mistakes in the last video. Alright, so first things first. In the critical passive demo, I misquoted how the critical multiplier increases when you get into the next crit tier. I'll pull up the old clip and I'll correct it now. Now we have a guaranteed 100% chance to get yellow crits, and always do 2.1 times damage, and a 3 to 4% chance to get an orange crit and deal 4.2 times damage. And there's the mistake. You do not go from 2.1 to 4.2. Here's the equation for increasing the critical damage when you reach a new crit tier. You can plug it in and you'll see that you instead go from 2.1 times damage to 3.2 times. And now to address the crit inherit aspects of Tornado. So I made a note on how I was using the Baruuk, and I was noticing that I was shooting the tornadoes and I was not getting the orange and red crits that I was getting when Zephyr was in the air. After a little digging and some help from commenters, we figured out that crit inherit actually works by taking the primary critical stats of a weapon, and it applies it to all alternate fire modes. In the case of the Baruuk, this hurts it a lot, because it's taking the crit stats of the quick fire, or the quick shot, instead of the large payload with the upped critical chance and damage. However, the base damage does increase. The base damage from the charge shots will be reflected in the damage numbers when you shoot the tornadoes. However, targeting the enemies directly instead of shooting the tornadoes is actually still an option, especially for gas damage setups. It was difficult to test, but I found that when I targeted the enemies inside the tornado instead of the tornadoes themselves, the gas damage ticks were larger by a good factor. Now there's one limitation to this, is that I mentioned in the older video that gas damage is really good at maxing out the damage of tornadoes, and this one seems to do it super quick, regardless of whether you shoot the tornadoes or the enemies, but it's definitely much faster when you shoot the enemies. But all this is to say that targeting the enemies instead will still deliver the payload, and if it's built with a damage type that, spreads around, kind of like electric or gas, the damage will transfer over and the tornadoes will take care of the rest. So, a lot of these I didn't have time to figure out or test, but I do have screenshots of the recommended builds and maybe a few Subsume options, and I'll just run you through the logic on why I think they're correct. Also, this is just for the sake of getting this out quickly. So this is a Subsume option from Julian Underwood, who put Silence on Zephyr, and he mentioned that this is a great crowd control god build Zephyr, since Acolytes can't do anything to, get in your way, and Xmas units are essentially useless with Silence active. I think that's a pretty good idea. The next one comes from Yasha, who believes that putting Spectre Ridge on Zephyr and using the Spectral Siphon Augment would be a great energy economy build. I think this is worth noting because Zephyr just doesn't have a way to regenerate energy on her own, and I don't see why this wouldn't work. As for me, I think some good Subsume options would be Pillage, because Zephyr has no shields and that is also an armor strip, as well as I showed you earlier, Entangle. It seems to be worth using. Of course, Zephyr doesn't need this, but you could use Eclipse, because of course you can, and Roar and Zada's Whisper. Any other damage ability is, I think, unnecessary, but you can try. I'm gonna suggest you don't do Terrify, because that gives you just an armor strip, which the raw damage Zephyr brings is already gonna overpower, and it doesn't give her anything else. So I don't suggest Terrify. There are probably a lot that are really, really fun, and we already have discovered that. Zephyr is just a toolkit, and she has a lot going for her. So I suggest plenty of creativity, and I'd love to hear what you come up with. Alright, so now's the time to pay attention, because these two images come from Zephyr, who is the person I alluded to, who the one who had like way too many Zephyr builds. So, pay attention. Zephyr primarily uses Zada's Whisper, Breach Surge, Thera Strike, and Nourish. I personally think Breach Surge is unnecessary, but also, I don't play Zephyr as much as this dude. So there you go. Thera Strike is an armor strip, which Zephyr does not need as well, at least in my opinion, but also a health return, which she does need. And Nourish is just instant viral damage, as well as better energy return. So, all those are really good ideas. Now, here is Zephyr's Nourish Zephyr build in great detail. I cannot test this, I do not have time at the moment. I wish I would, I wish I could. I may later in the future, but you probably won't hear about that, because I'm not going to play Zephyr for a while after this. But here you go, in excruciating detail, Zephyr's Nourish Zephyr. And that does it. That is all I have for now. There was many more I wanted to include, but I don't want to continue doing this just showing you pictures of words. So I apologize for that. Again, the rush is because I want to get this out today or tonight. I'm sure you can forgive me for that. Thank you everyone who commented. Genuinely thank you. We recently, earlier in the video you saw me show a card that said, hey, past 7,000 subscribers, or rather, views. Now we're past 10,000 on the original video. I am floored. I'm completely humbled. Thank you, all of you. I'll give a thank you to Ayun Tey, of course, who I messaged for permission to use his video, and he said yes. Thank you, Ayun. I appreciate it. And I have not yet contacted, or I probably won't, contact Dystopia, because dude's pretty high caliber. But I'm assuming he'll say, it's cool, and thank you for letting me use your material twice, or reference it rather. Thank you everyone who subscribed. Thank you again, Nova, Umbro, as well as Gamble, for the initial push. I don't think I would have gotten to 10,000 nearly as quickly without you guys. So, now that leaves the question. What's next? Let me show you.